Endgame automates the hunt for both known and never-before-seen adversaries in enterprise networks. Built on unique knowledge on the adversary's tools, techniques, and tactics, Endgame's centrally managed agent prevents, detects, and responds to advanced adversaries in the earliest stages of the kill chain without prior knowledge. Endgame, automate the hunt. IT Pro TV, binge-worthy learning for IT teams. Why is it binge-worthy? It's learning presented in an engaging and entertaining talk show format that beats voice-over PowerPoint snooze fests. Watch over 3,300 hours of content in their on-demand library on your desktop, on the go, or in the comfort of your own living room. IT Pro TV is IT training you and your team actually want to watch, which means a better return on your learning investment. Get started with IT Pro TV for Teams by visiting itpro.tv/Security Weekly and start a 7-day free trial and get 30% off standard or premium IT Pro TV memberships using the code SECWeekly30.
And welcome back to the show. First stories of the week, but before we get started, ticket sales are open for the Social Engineering Rhode Island Conference taking place on Saturday, June 8th at Salve Regina University in Newport, Rhode Island. And you can find more information at se-ri.com and where you can register. One of the organizers of the conference, Patrick Laverty, will be joining us for an interview in I believe next week. Really interesting conference to have one dedicated to social engineering specifically here in this area. So check it out and go support Patrick and the organization of said conference.
Patrick's a great guy, actually. I used to be on the B-Sides Boston organizing committee with him and worked with him at Rapid 7 at the time. I don't know if he's still with them, but as a human being, he is an excellent person, and I really look forward to his conference because I'm actually volunteering there, so I'll be there.
Woo! Awesome.
All right.
Awesome. So, what do we got for stories, gentlemen? I had a couple, but nothing. There was only one that really sort of grabbed me that was kind of interesting. But I know Keith posted ones that I want to hear about.
Yeah, I think the cool one that I jumped into earlier this week was the FinFisher Exposed, story number 1 under my stories. And it talks about a bit of malware called FinFisher, not to be confused with Phineas Fisher, the kind of pseudo-famous hacker with the sock puppet. But it was talking about Office 365 Advanced Threat Protection and how there was a group called Neodymium that was effectively going about leveraging not only zero-day exploits for Microsoft and Adobe, but as well as like advanced government-grade surveillance spyware to go ahead and try and like bypass Microsoft protections. I don't know if you guys had a chance to pull up the article itself, but it actually has kind of some guides, and it actually had something like 7 layers of obfuscation associated with it that were associated with the actual malware itself. That's intense. I mean, especially for what you guys do in the realm of pen testing, like that seems a bit excessive. What do you guys think about that?
Maybe excessive. I think a really great idea to up the game. But that many layers from me, practically from a pen test perspective, I don't know that we necessarily need to go that many layers still. So I think maybe there was some future proofing for going that deep. Joff, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. A lot of pen testing tends to be exploiting low-hanging fruit and poor configurations and things that that get us places without having to work too hard, to be honest, right? But that said, there has been considerable improvements in a number of places, certainly more sophisticated customers of ours, which have forced us to up the game. So I don't know, I have mixed feelings.
Yeah, and Joff, certainly more when you start talking more red team type engagement, when there is significantly more need for stealth and the need to avoid detection.
Certainly. I got a perfect example today. Well, maybe not a perfectly fitting example to the story, but in terms of custom sophistication, I was testing today, and I was on an internal desktop, and I threw down a password spray, and they kicked me off that network so fast it made my head spin. It was just like, boom, gotcha, get out.
Wow.
And you don't see a password spray for our listeners is when you enumerate all the accounts in a domain and then you try one password or a very small number of passwords for all of those accounts. You're trying to avoid account lockout. It's pretty rare for defensive operations to actually have the capability to pick up on that and react to it, in a small amount of time. But this was less than 5 minutes, and I was out.
Absolutely, and that is a really great, sophisticated customer that you want to work with to up your game.
Absolutely, because then you're like, oh, well, maybe I shouldn't have been so damn noisy.
And then you realize
come in a little slower.
Yeah, and then you even think about that and like, I really wasn't all that noisy to begin with, except.
Well, it's right. It kind of makes your head. It gives you a little bit of a
like I only tested one password for 3,000 accounts. Oh, well, the 3,000 accounts thing, maybe I need to slow that thing.
Well, and it varies all across the board, right? So because, the week before last, I did the same thing to 66,000 accounts in a very large organization. And I think I did it 10 times that day and nobody noticed, So.
It makes you wonder, especially, so following that tangent for a bit, it makes you wonder if the way that they're detecting it is the domain from which you're, like, effectively your IP address from which you're making the request, if they follow based on the requests made by your like IP address or your MAC address or what have you to actually log in, right? Like that's the only way you could really detect that, because you're not triggering on failed login attempts on those accounts. You're not triggering on certain, bad passwords maybe that are being used from like the Have I Been Pwned database of passwords, for example. So I'd be interested to learn more about like how they actually detected you doing the credential stuffing attack as opposed to why the other organization didn't catch it.
Yeah, well, a lot of people, there's a couple of things that go into it. One is if an organization, there is this sort of sweet spot, I think, in the blue team side where an organization is just small enough and just big enough at the same time to have enough resources, but also not to have to cover so much territory. And when you find that sweet spot, you tend to find fairly sophisticated operations that have, if they've taken the time to train their people, if they've taken the time to bring the right consultants in, they get very sophisticated in their defenses. Now, the ones that get to the very large size, they're dealing with a massive scale issue, and it tends to dilute that effort a little bit, or at least slow it down. They may be sophisticated, but just the scale issues alone get in the way a little bit.
Well, I wonder if to some extent it's the scale issues that come around like SIEM, right? Like, so the security incident event management, where they can't actually aggregate all that information because the licenses to actually put that into their SIM are too much. So they're actually like cutting down on what they're looking for. So it sounds almost as though it's problems of scale where you have an organization that is just large enough to have the right head count. They have enough bandwidth to actually be able to do some additional tooling, maybe even some open source software. And they have the ability to actually afford the licenses for all of that kind of detection. So they can actually get on this, whereas problems of scale is just too much, too big, not enough head count.
Yeah, and then there's two types of organization broadly, in my experience, that have been able to perform very sophisticated defenses. In terms of the population count, just to give a number, the 3,000 to 5,000 endpoint space tends to be in that sweet spot, in my experience, if they've invested in the right people and the right technical implementation and the right knowledge and training. And then you occasionally get, and I do have a customer or two like this, customers in the sub 100 endpoint space, which are very, very exposed and have a very particular need. And so they have, one or maybe two, but very, very good InfoSec people on staff. And when I say they have the need, I'm talking probably high-end, very high-end financial with lots to protect.
By endpoints, would you include their cloud architecture as well, or would you just be endpoints as in like desktop network based?
Yeah, I'm thinking user endpoints when I speak in endpoint language. And then those folks that get, up into the 60 to 100,000 space, they've just got a whole different problem. Right? Yep. They have to develop strategies to deal with the volume of events. One, but then to appropriately triage and parse out the massive amount of false positives they have to deal with.
So it's
just a whole different space.
And Jaffa, I'd love to hear some of your experience on this too, because we did some work recently, and you talk about doing a password spray for 66,000 accounts, and I laugh in your general direction because I did one fairly recently for just over 1 million.
Wow!
But the challenge for this particular one for the customer was, and I'm only speculating here, is that I think that they thought that, this would be really great because we don't have to do a lot of security monitoring because the password spray we did against Microsoft's hosted O365, and it was against their domain at Microsoft as opposed to their own internal hosted solutions. So managing something like that and discovering something like that adds additional challenges.
I was going to say, I wonder if they even have visibility into that, right? Like if their O365 architecture is even something that they have the ability to get in between, so they can even begin to detect that, right? Like, would that be on Microsoft's hands at that point, or?
It's a great question.
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't know how. To be honest, I'm not a O365 sysadmin expert. I don't know how that they instrument that environment and how they would pick up that event. It'd be nice to hear from somebody that is managing a large O365 deployment to see how they're actually instrumenting it for password sprays in particular, actually, because we find ourselves at Black Hills, spraying up against, that didn't sound right, but spraying large public-facing environments, certainly in the red team context when we don't have an internal access of any kind. And, you can very easily spray VPN portals or O365.
Sure.
Or the one that came to mind recently in last couple of 3 weeks is Skype for Business, formerly Link, portals that are hanging out there on the network, which have some interesting characteristics that not only allow you to spray them for passwords, but also allow you to validate whether your reconnaissance, whether your username list is actually valid as well because of timing attacks.
Yeah.
And so there's some interesting stuff out there.
Yeah, and Joff, back to your comments about the size of the organization and what they've chosen to invest in from both a product and an individual perspective. We did some, the amazing part that we did one not that long ago. That was a vulnerability assessment that turned into a pen test accidentally. Like your vulnerability assessment accidentally turns into a pen test because it was just so easy.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And, so as part of that, delivering extra value, you use the results that you get to do additional discovery. When I say this, the person is going to laugh that potentially listens to the show that, we're not telling who it is. But when I say that of the 312 user accounts, 225 of them were in the domain admins group, you begin to wonder about some of those things. Well, you clearly they had a problem internally, and they fixed it by granting everyone the access that they needed and then some.
Wow. Yeah, that's unfortunate. The other interesting thing you find is there is also a scale problem on the pen tester end when you're dealing with very, very large environments and you get a lot of attack surface. Then you're facing the situation of which way do I turn first? Mm-hmm. It doesn't always happen, but we've definitely encountered that. I've had password sprays. Staying with that topic for a minute, very large organizations drop out 200 or 300 accounts that are that are legitimate passwords, and then I've got to go through all those and
figure out which one do I want to use.
Group structure and find out whether they're in different groups and whether they're useful, and it's that kind of problem.
Yep.
Ironically, it's almost like when you get those really large organizations with a huge footprint, whether it's applications out on the web or web presences or what have you, right? Like crowdsourcing for what I do at BugCrowd, right? Like that's where we fit in really, really well because to your point, Joff, it's like you only have so much time and only so many paths you can traverse inside of the testing window. Whereas for the customers, it's like you have a lot of testers being able to look at that all at the same time.
Yep.
Yeah, that's why we hate you, I think.
It's okay, Joff. Honestly, I think that Paul and I had it out a few weeks ago on Application Security Weekly when we talked about there's really a place for both, right? Like to the extent that the web application presence is growing. I mean, I think it was something like 50% of the CVEs in 2017 were web application related. That space is huge and growing because of things like the cloud and because of things like Office 365 that are leading to the benefits of crowdsourced testing. But still, people have an operating system and they have a network and they have their firewalls and they have their Active Directory that they need to test and they need to make sure it's secure. And there are experts that can do that. And by the way, it's both of you, Larry and Joff. Like you guys are the experts at that. I couldn't do that in my day job.
It's a good comment. There's space for everybody, I think, is what you're saying. And crowdsourced testing with public internet-facing web applications, it works well. I mean, I think that's an appropriate thing for people to do. You get a lot of eyes on. You get good bang for your buck. Sometimes people may want to have pen testers as a extra resource alongside that. I've seen that happen with some of our customers, and actually both models together work pretty well as well, because you get a different slant, a different look at it.
Absolutely.
So yeah, it's but to your point on the limited time and resources, pen test is a fixed scope. Normally, it is a fixed amount of time, and once we get through most of that time, we're going to wrap it up and go to report writing, and that doesn't that kind of artificially constrains pen tests. The attackers don't have that constraint, right? Some cases the attackers have limitless time, limitless budget, or no money anyway, so they got nothing to lose. But either way, it's a different world. So it's a good point.
Driving the conversation back to the O365 FinFisher malware, though, I just wanted to cover quickly, and we can move on to another story because I know we have a lot of other ones in here. But the 7 stages that it went through to obfuscate the actual spyware that they were dropping was stage 0 was a dropper, which was a 32-bit virtual machine, followed by a loader and debug sandbox evasion, followed by a secondary loader with a 64-bit virtual machine.
That's awesome.
Followed by an installer with a UAC bypass, and then after a memory loader and injection, leading to WinLogin Explorer DLL injection, and then finally the spyware payload. I mean, talk about doing your darndest to obfuscate everything to do with this malware. The whole write-up itself, again, it's story number 1 under my stories for this week on the wiki, wiki.securityweekly.com. Check it out. It has a really, really good write-up of all the things that they did to actually, peel back the onion here.
Wait. So let me get this straight, because I'm confused. They used a 32-bit virtual machine to deploy a loader to deploy a separate 64-bit virtual machine.
Yeah. With a secondary loader, yeah.
Secondary, so not cascaded. So it wasn't that the 32-bit virtual machine was running the 64-bit virtual machine within it. It was separate.
Correct.
Okay.
So it's almost rather than kind of going inward, as might be thought of. It's like almost like they were kind of moving around in the organization. Yep. So it's going to different points of the actual application of the software that was being dropped. So
they went laterally as opposed to deep.
Yeah, so maybe if they had started with a 64-bit and then moved down to a 32-bit, that would make sense from a memory allocation space perspective. But this, I mean, the whole like deobfuscation and the work that Microsoft did inside of this article to actually peel back everything that was being done with this spyware was intense. So if you have 25 minutes during lunch, maybe in the next few days, sit down and go read this if you're in the reverse engineering or the malware analysis space, if you work in a security operations center, because it's going to be valuable information for you to consume.
Very cool.
All right, gentlemen, what else we got?
So I'm curious, especially because we were talking a little bit more about penetration testing. I'd be really curious, Larry, to get a little bit more info on your story number 4 about how Kali is now available on Windows.
Oh my God, this is seems wrong. It's like it's like
wrong and yet so right at the same time.
It's like doing what was it? Boot camp on your Mac to boot Windows on your Mac. Like you push the power button and you hear the Windows boot sound. I'm like, that just seems wrong.
So the The interesting thing about this, and I was reading some of Adrian Santabria's tweets about this. So Adrian is also speaking at InfoSec World here in a couple of weeks. And Adrian was talking about how effectively this is giving you a virtual machine of Kali Linux without any of the packages installed. So you have to still install all of the Kali Linux software that you want to use inside of that virtual machine. But otherwise, it's a way for you to have Windows subsystem for Linux leveraging Kali and the Kali packages accordingly onside of your desktop.
Right, and one of the things that I think that's kind of fascinating about this, while it seems quite unnatural that you're now running Kali on your Windows desktop in Windows itself with the Linux subsystem, I think this really has some interesting features in that, I've been known to use Kali on more than one occasion, even when I still like to roll my own distro for doing pen test work. Why? Because there's just that one time, or there's that half a dozen cases where I want to use that tool in a pen test, and for whatever reason, I cannot get that thing installed with my OS of choice, and in Kali, it just works.
At some point, Larry, you and I are going to have to sit down and have a conversation about how Kali actually has a Docker container image that you can use for like one-off tools.
Yep.
So super lightweight as comparative to running the whole virtual machine. I'm sure you and I would have a really fun conversation about that at some point.
I think we should, because I need to improve my Docker knowledge, and that's one of the paths that I'm currently working down. And sometimes the student becomes the master. My intern is currently schooling me in Docker.
Well, as Paul will say, if you were here, right? Like, there's so much to know and learn with Docker that it's really one of those tools that even in the last year, really, it has become the enterprise containerization tool of choice. And so there is ever more development on it. Kubernetes is a big thing for Docker orchestration. And so the rabbit hole is deep and vast. And so I'm sure that we'll have more conversations on it at some point.
Yes. Joff, you had something to say there, buddy.
No, I just would say I agree with you guys. I've done some development in Docker and experimented with it some to understand the attraction and to understand some of the challenges. And I think there's no doubt in my mind why it is such a successful entity, because it solves, especially in the world of Python, actually, strangely enough, it solves so many of the dependency issues that we struggle with in the one operating system world for deployment. I mean, the DevOps issues that it solves are they're huge, and it's such a win. So I'm going to certainly continue my development process with Docker where I can. And in terms of micro-architecting for better security, Docker actually offers you a lot. If you've got a security mindset like all of us do, Docker is going to feel pretty good to you if you've got a developer head about you as well. And it does some things, or should I put it this way? You can do some things which, in a microarchitecture perspective, which make things just so much better security-wise. So I think it's a really interesting evolvement of the technology.
One of just the last comment on Docker in general is Solomon Hykes, who's the founder of Docker, was highlighting an article a few weeks ago on Twitter. And it wasn't actually an article. It was a presentation at a conference that he was sitting at, which was talking about Linux Kit and Linux Kit's use of Docker to actually build an operating system kind of from scratch using containers in the same way that sort of CoreOS or Cubes is kind of separating out all the pieces of the operating system. So he had a tweet about that a few weeks ago, and I thought it was impressive because it's like soon the operating system won't be this monolithic piece of code that you install. It's suddenly this microarchitecture or microservices architecture where calc.exe is an entirely separate container than, say, your browser and so on and so forth. So it was interesting.
Right. Kubernetes, it's the future.
Indeed.
Have you seen that Circle CI blog article?
I haven't.
It's good. And, it's one of those things where Kubernetes is in itself interesting because it's like an orchestration of Docker, whereas they already have Docker Swarm, which is kind of an orchestration of Docker containers as well. So, I'm sure going into other analogies, the whole idea of like using regex, you have 99 problems and then you use regex and then you have 100 problems. It almost feels like Kubernetes is like that, but maybe not, because it's actually taken off as an architecture or as a configuration system. So
yeah, yep. We've been going lots of tangents tonight, and which is totally fine and totally awesome, because it's all related to stuff we've been talking about. But yeah, so for me, the Kali on Windows was one of those mind-blown type of moments, and like to the converse of like running PowerShell on Linux. Like, for those of us who grew up in that time frame, it's like, your chocolate's in my peanut butter. No, your peanut butter's in my chocolate. You know, two great tastes that taste great together. So it's very much a converse of the PowerShell on Linux that now we've got Kali on Windows, which is
it's a little mind bending, but you know, especially for those of us who grew up in the world that thou shalt not cross the swords, as you say. But I don't know, I'm liking it. You know, the Windows 10 kernel has gotten so much better, and some of these features that are coming to it are interesting. I love the fact that PowerShell, I like that example you brought up, Larry. I love the fact that PowerShell was opened up and we have a Linux access there as well. It's just really pretty cool stuff.
I think it's very much starting down the path, and I'm going to call it now, starting down the path of the time when we used to say, use the right tool for the right job. And
you actually can now.
Yeah, and quite honestly, you have choices. You can use multiple tools to do the right job. You don't have to use Windows to do X. You can use Linux to do PowerShell, and now you want to use some Linux-based tool that was formerly under Kali and worked really well under Kali. You can use that under Windows. So it's becoming much more heterogeneous in that you can use whatever you need to use almost anywhere.
And if I'm not mistaken, I think that Microsoft is actually one of the #1 contributors to actual Linux itself over the last few years. I mean, they are doing so much to push forward that space in terms of operating systems and functionality that it's almost scary, but at the same time, it's kind of impressive. At the same time, it's almost like the Borg, right? Like, if you can't beat them, join them. Yes. So,
or if you can't beat them, buy them.
But in the case of Linux, there's no one to buy, because it's buy.
You can always contribute, though.
Exactly. Right? Resistance is futile.
So, Larry, I'd actually be really interested to go into your story number 3 as well, which is the subdomain brute forcing. Tell us more about that.
So, this is one of those ones that I don't necessarily understand in its entirety, but it was one of those things that I stumbled across for a tool. And, at work, we share tools back and forth, like, hey, we just saw this thing and that it might be interesting to you guys doing pen test and OSINT work and all of this type of stuff. So it's definitely not one of those ones that I understand very well, and I'm still trying to dig into. But from doing some passive OSINT work where, as a pen tester externally and digging up information, misconfigured DNS transfers for AXFR, we're awesome, but how many of those do you really see
that
anymore?
Attack surface is pretty dead now.
Yeah, exactly. So what's the new replacement? And the ability to, with certificate transparency, now gives us some of that back based on our TLS certificate stuff. So there was a website out there that, when I posted this tool, one of our guys, Adam, said, "Oh yeah, this is awesome, because I've just been using this website where you plug the domain in and you get all the stuff back." And then he started to dig into the code, and really what this is, it's a wrapper for accessing the API for this website that he was already using. But my comment was, script all the things and do some automation and make your job easier. So
honestly, this would be a really excellent tool for bug bounty hunters in general, and so getting into the kind of the crowdsourced security space, because one of the things that we do at BugCrowd is for our customers as they're looking to come on board is we actually do a subdomain like OSINT lookup of everything that they probably own so that they know all of the different subdomains that have been registered for them. And that's really important because the customer doesn't always know like what they have. It's kind of like asset management. Mm-hmm. And the tool that we've used for that traditionally is a tool called Sublister, which is a free and open source and available on GitHub. And seeing this use certificate transparency effectively to find all of the HTTPS websites in a few seconds is pretty awesome comparative to Sublister, which actually scrapes like Baidu, Bing, Google, and others for like cached versions of subdomains. So this is actually really awesome.
Yeah. So Keith, can you tell me a little bit about what the whole certificate transparency thing and what the potential abuse here is?
Yeah. So what it is effectively like I believe it's Google that runs the certificate transparency project.
It is.
In effect, what it is it's that if you give out or release a certificate, the certificate transparency is intended for companies to say, okay, we have registered or given out certificates for the following domains. And actually, Symantec is the one that got in a whole lot of trouble for this and is being blacklisted, if I'm not mistaken, by Google browser as a result of registering certificates for Google.com for their quote-unquote lab. And I think that the whole Trustico issue, which I'm sure you guys covered last week, and certainly we did on Application Security Weekly, is related to suddenly Symantec being blacklisted by the world's largest browser. So in effect, what this is it's allowing you to say, okay, I want to know all of the potential subdomains listed off of the top level domain using that certificate. Usually it's a star certificate, or maybe it's got like specific subdomains. Yeah. So it's a nice way for companies to know who's registering certificates maybe illicitly against their website, but it's also a really, really good tool for attackers or bug bounty hunters to figure out what's the actual managed space based on the certificates that are registered under their certificate authority.
Excellent. And so, talking about some of that managed space, some of that managed space may or may not feature additional functionality that was not intended, and if they don't know about it, then that's a problem.
Yeah, I mean, open scope bug bounty programs are one of the best tools for companies to figure out what assets that are out there that they maybe didn't know or haven't managed. There are a number of them on BugCrowd that are out there. Netgear is probably my personal favorite, just because their Kudos run program is anything that Netgear owns out there you can report against, and they are very happy to suddenly realize, oh, hey, wait, that event site that we had for a German event that we had 2 years ago is still up there and available and has all sorts of problems related to it that we didn't know was still even live. They're happy to know about that and actually take it down. So
that's awesome. Very cool. Joff, any comments on that one?
No. I was otherwise distracted.
Boobies. I mean,
next story.
The other two that I've got, Keith, aren't. I didn't think were particularly interesting, except for the Memcache D stuff was kind of interesting, but hadn't really had an opportunity to really dig into it as much as I really should. And it was starting to it was more of a bookmark for me to start figuring out exactly what I need to think about Memcache D.
So what it is, that's actually tied directly to my story number 3. So
beautiful.
Memcache D is effectively like content delivery networks, which cache information about given websites and what have you to the server. Now, but what it does,
Keith, isn't it? I know you're probably going to explain it, but I'm going to interrupt you anyway. Isn't it also the Memcache D actually talks to each other? So it's actually a network of memory caching, is the way I understand it. Which is its intent is to speed up and offload that I/O so that you get massive scale improvement. Now the DDoS, you take it on the DDoS. It's all about spoofing a source IP, if I remember correctly. But you tell me.
Yes, so you're absolutely right, Joff. It is about spoofing the source IP, which is pretty easy, as we all know. But what it ends up being is that the Memcache servers themselves that respond publicly to direct requests can amplify back responses up to 50 times the request size. So now, if I'm spoofing the source domain or source IP of where the requests are coming from, and then send like maybe 100 of these Memcache servers that request, suddenly I'm getting 50 times amplification. And so last week we saw that GitHub was being hit with something like 1.3 terabytes. Or terabits, excuse me, of DDoS attack, which Akamai managed to take down. And then in my story number 3, NetScout was, so specifically Arbor Networks, confirmed a 1.7 terabit DDoS against a target as well. So
now the question is, did NetScout/Arbor survive?
So my understanding is yes. I don't know. I didn't dig into exactly what they did to actually off-put this accordingly. I know that GitHub used, I think it was Akamai Prolexic to kind of take care of and deal with the DDoS. And as soon as the DDoSers realized that, hey, guess what? Akamai is now taking this over, so there's nothing we can do about it, they stopped.
Yep. And I think this also speaks volumes to how some of these DDoS prevention folks like Akamai and Arbor and so forth have approached the problem, in that they've so much improved since Mirai has happened.
Yeah. I mean, for that, it was, distributed denial of service, which was true DDoS of a botnet nature for Mirai, whereas it was device being taken over and then, making requests specifically to an endpoint or to a server. But in this case, it's servers that are now reflecting requests back out to a target based on a spoof IP address.
Right. One of the things that really, really bothers me about distributed denial of service is that so many of the networks out there, not the ISPs. I mean, the ISPs, they have to carry the traffic, right? But so many of the networks out there, the end customers can absolutely prevent spoofing of source IP addresses, right? All you do is put an ACL on your edge router or turn on the appropriate feature on your firewall to not allow a packet that is not sourced from your network block out onto the internet, and it completely stops the problem. And people don't do it. I just don't get that. I mean, to me, being a good network citizen means if a packet emanates from inside my network, not from my address space, it should be dropped, and vice versa, right? If a packet comes to me that is not destined for my space, it should be dropped, period.
So, Joff, I'm curious to get your kind of thoughts on this as well. Is there at some point where the firewalls as they exist hit an I/O threshold whereby they're dropping effectively everything because they're DDoSed or they're receiving so much traffic? Is there at any point where they would actually run into a problem of that sort of nature?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I mean, but it's irrelevant, because if you are the target of the attack, it doesn't matter if you've got the controls in place to drop it or if you're passing the traffic. It turns out to be irrelevant anyway, because you're going down regardless, right?
Right. It's about the size of your pipe, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bazinga!
Oh, Larry just brings it home.
So effectively, the size of the pipe and the hole
my point is, though, the anti-spoofing filters are fairly trivial to implement. And if you're singly homed on the network, or even if you're multi-homed on the network, as long as you're not a transit network, then you can implement anti-spoofing, and it's not too difficult to do. And if everybody took that measure, then the ability for spoofed source address DDoS would drastically be reduced.
You heard it here first. You heard it here first, folks, and hopefully not the last.
Interestingly, as well, with that problem, I think is kind of a separate problem, which is those customers that end up buying something like Cloudflare, for example, and so they feel like they are protected behind that content delivery network accordingly. But for me, putting on like my security researcher hat on for a moment, generally to find out what the actual endpoint IP address is, for example, I would go out to VirusTotal and look at, okay, that's Cloudflare, that's Cloudflare, that's Cloudflare. Oh wait, that's not. Like let's test that endpoint to see if that ends up being the actual server that I'm trying to hit. And so you're right, Joff. It's a situation where there are a lot of controls that companies don't put in place to actually protect their infrastructure, because they buy a service that they can sit behind and they feel like they are safe without actually taking the extra step or the next step of doing something about their IP address at the endpoint that is actually being served through Cloudflare to be different than what was cached or saved by things like VirusTotal.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely so. And people shouldn't forget there's reputational damage. I mean, if you are the source, let's say you're a very large network. Larry and I and Paul and a lot of us have worked in environments where we're very large networks. we have very large pipes, right? Some cases multi 1 gig, some case multi 10 gig, maybe even beyond that, and we've got pipes up to providers. So if we are the source as a very large network entity, even if we're an end network, we're not an ISP. If we're the source of a distributed denial of service attack, we should be completely embarrassed by that. I mean, people need to pay attention to that shouldn't be happening, and that's being a bad citizen, essentially. So this is the other thing. It's got to be something that it frustrates me because having operated in that environment before as a defensive network engineer, I was able to completely eliminate the problem. Now, that didn't mean that I wasn't a victim of a DDoS, but I certainly wasn't the source of them.
And I think one of the best things that I was listening to another podcast this week that is kind of pointing out to, hopefully this problem will be solved, because suddenly those memcache servers that are sitting out there on the internet that people are finding through Shodan and abusing, they're going to have a very, very large bill at the end of this month, because suddenly everybody is starting to abuse them accordingly. And they're going to go about taking corrective measures accordingly after the month of, hopefully, February, but if not March, to take care of this, because honestly, nobody wants to keep paying those bills, and they're going to figure out, oh wait, we were the source of the problem.
Right. Well, that's the other thing. It costs, right? A lot of people don't. In my prior life, I worked in the university world, and so people didn't think about the cost so much because it was going to the state. But it still was real money in the end. It's just a matter of who's funding it. In this case, it was taxpayers, but it's a real deal. So. A bit of a segue, if you guys don't mind, but
please do.
Speaking of real money, my story number 4 goes to how Equifax managed to recover $114 million on a $26.5 million expense from their breach. In effect, they made 75% of the $114 million, more or less, was pure profit. I'm really curious to get your guys' thoughts on that, because as we all know, the Equifax breach affected, many millions of Americans, and suddenly the company that led to the breach ends up making money off of it.
Mm-hmm. That's not right.
It makes me angry. That's all I can say. 57% of the adult population, I remember quoting, doing the numbers at the time, 57%, my estimate, of the adult population of the United States had their personal data compromised, and these guys are making money out of it now. Come on, guys. Yeah, it bothers me.
And even better, the initial result for their services was something that in many cases 57% of the adult population doesn't have any ability to opt out of your customer, whether you like it or not, assuming you have any credit in the United States.
That's the part that actually bothers me the most. Did you ever agree to have your data stored by this company, and did you ever agree to that being shared to any other entity? You had no control over that, and that's the part that I think is most egregious, and that needs to be addressed. I haven't followed it in political circles to see what the fallout is or is not at this point. It seems like it's been buried by so many other issues. And I don't think we've seen any action, but don't quote me on it. I haven't actually researched whether any federal legislation has actually come of it.
So Jeff, actually, I have seen. So in my work at BugCrowd, I have actually encountered some of what the political landscape looks like on this today, which is they are moving forward with, it looks like, putting forward legislation that will require companies of the type like Equifax that consume or aggregate data based on a large population to purchase vulnerability disclosure programs. And I can say firsthand from working at BugCrowd, we had something like 4 or 5 customers who were vulnerable to the same Apache Struts 2 vulnerability that Equifax was breached with. Within 24 hours of that vulnerability becoming publicly known, those customers that we already had on the books were informed about it by our researchers. And then within 36 hours thereafter, they ended up fixing the vulnerability. I mean, it's a situation where suddenly you have, the means, method, and motivation to actually go out and find these kind of bugs for private organizations through a crowdsourced model, because you get a paid a bounty on it. And at the end of the day, what ends up happening is those companies find out about it sooner and they fix it, hopefully. Whereas with Equifax, I think their CEO, when he was out in front of Congress, or former CEO, I should say, said that all the tools that they were using did not detect that they had the vulnerability, which in some ways goes to show the value of something like a crowdsourced model versus traditional, like, DAST or SAST scanning tools. But yeah, I think that what's going to end up happening is vulnerability disclosure, whether that's from publicly sourced researchers or through penetration tests, will become the norm. And it's already become the norm in NIST standards as it stands today.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good counter to that particular response of Equifax. I would have asked the question, what are your peers doing? Is your vulnerability management program defective, right? That's the question that comes to mind. Because, frankly, others with scanners or whatever means they used, be it, crowdsourcing or whatever, they were able to address the problem. I guess it's the old sort of 800-pound gorilla became a big example.
No pun intended.
In an awfully bad way, right? Yeah, no pun intended. Yeah.
And, unfortunately, I think that with the world that we live in today, this is certainly not going to be the last that we see of this kind of breach of this nature, especially where it's situations where you can't opt out of the data aggregation that takes place, which in some ways is a really good segue to another story that I have, if you guys don't mind.
Yeah, and I think that'll be the last one.
Sure.
Right.
So my story number 6 is kind of interesting because I myself don't have a Facebook account, which I covered last week on Application Security Weekly as to some of the reasons why. But what's interesting about this is apparently Facebook keeps a file on all internet users. And you can actually, if you have a Facebook account, retrieve your file as to the information that they are tracking. To that end, if you end up, if Facebook were to get breached and suddenly all of your sort of browsing data were to become publicly available or tracking data, I don't know if that would be worse than an Equifax or equivalent or somewhat less or diminished in terms of the impact. But that seems pretty serious that even if you're not a Facebook user, they are effectively aggregating data on you today.
So they're aggregating data on even if you're not a Facebook user. So one would have to ask, how are they going about that? And then the why question is really kind of disturbing.
So I think that the how gets to actually something that we covered last week on Application Security Weekly, which is whenever you go to a website and they have those kind of icons for, follow us on Facebook, for example, right? Those servers that the follow us on Facebook lead to are controlled by Facebook. Mm-hmm. So every time your browser makes a request out to the internet for that system or that server that is serving up that specific link, they can track you in some ways, right? And so if they can say, okay, based on where your source is coming from, we can say that you are on this site, and then you are on this site, and you're on the following site. And in some ways, if you take enough of that information together, you can start to build a profile as to who the user is based on where they're browsing to, which is kind of scary, right?
Oh, absolutely. That actually opens up an entire other conversation, which is the I hate using this word, but I'll use it, the ecosystem of the advertising technology and content provider networks, which is a massive ecosystem. People are really not very well aware of what's going on there. And it is very, very surreptitious and very much an invasion of privacy, well, for what little privacy we all have anymore.
Yeah, and to that end, that's exactly who they're selling the data to. Is we might not know that this user specifically is, Geoff Thayer or Keith Hodlett or Larry Pesci, but we know that that user is looking at wiki.securityweekly.com and looking at Ars Technica or Wired articles, and so maybe we're going to start pitching them based on the advertisements security products. Maybe it's firewalls when you go to a specific website, or
SANS training, or
right.
Yeah. It's disturbing. I've often thought, I know this is going to sound like pie in the sky idea, but I've often thought that we need some sort of framework where, ownership of personally identifiable information is passed back to the actual real owner, and that they have a software mechanism that they can control the distribution of, your own data. That would take regulation to do. But if that was in place and it was a standard where, all personally identifiable information had to have user access control back to the owner, and blockchain technology may well be the way to get there, I think it would radically change people's view, first of all, just in the general populace of what's going on, but also people's behavior in how they want to control that. I mean, you've got to put it back in the hands of the actual person. That's my opinion.
I wonder if GDPR is just the first step down that path, Josh, just because of the really big stick that GDPR comes with in terms of the way in which you handle user data. I don't know if, Larry, if you have any comments or thoughts on that as well. I imagine you must be working with a lot of customers who are very concerned about that today.
My only comment was, ooh. And then I'll leave it at that.
That requirement's onerous, and it's going to be extremely painful transition, but I actually do think it's a first step down that road, Keith. I anticipate we're going to see a lot of legal action, and whether it actually holds together through the international courts will be interesting, right? Because it's got world impact, and this is of course the other ultimate issue with anything on the internet, is that nothing is local anymore. But it's got world impact, so it has to be talked about worldwide. Certainly in North America and in Europe, but it's going to go beyond that as well, Asia and so on. So, it's going to be interesting to see how that goes. But I really would like, as a security community, actually, if there's something I could get behind, it would be the advancement of a data ownership standard where there is something that puts the control back in the end user's hands of their own PII.
Hear, hear.
And with that,
yes,
Larry, are we going to end the show? Who's going to take us out today?
I think we are. Well, Keith brought us in, so I think it's death match as to who is going to take us out.
Are we in a rock, paper, scissors?
I think you should. Ready?
Hang on. How do you play this game again? Okay.
Right. Joff, rock, paper, scissors.
Yeah.
Ready?
Okay. 1, 2, 3. Ready?
One, two,
3. Oh, your scissors cuts my paper. Okay, Keith gets it.
So Keith, you're taking us out.
All right. Over and out.